Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. This is Sally Alsop. I am a member of the ICG committee, and with Lucy's support, I look after the webinar programme. In today's webinar, you'll be hearing from ICG member Soti from Data Chronicle. Soti is the founder at Data Chronicle, where he is responsible for strategy and information design. He's on a mission to help people make an impact by telling better stories with data and is focused on creating engaging experiences, producing infographics and data visualizations. This morning, Soti will be sharing some of these skills with us in his talk entitled Making It Pop, an Introduction to Data Visualization. Soti will describe how to gain a unique edge by presenting data and insights in a way that gets noticed, remembered and acted upon. You'll also learn data visualization best practices, both quant and qual, and tips to get you started for free. You'll have a chance to ask Soti some questions at the end, so please type them into the question box as we go through, and I'll read them out after Soti's presentation. Before I hand over to Soti, here are the next webinars for your diaries. We've got quite a full programme. Some of them are already open for registration. Also, there are still some sponsorship opportunities for a couple of the forthcoming webinars if anybody is interested. This costs £100 for a lot of exposure on our website, mailers and social media, and of course on the day. So our speaker today is Soti from Data Chronicle, and I'll now hand over to Soti.
Morning, everybody. Lovely to be here, and welcome to Making It Pop, an introduction to data visualization. Thanks a lot, Sally. As Sally mentioned earlier, in this webinar, I'm going to look at some database best practices for both quant and qual types of data. We'll also do some chart makeovers towards the end of the webinar. And finally, we'll look at some how-to, some tools and resources that can help you get started on a budget. I've been working in the data industry for about 20 years, and I started my business, Data Chronicle, back in 2015. I was actually working for a climate change think tank at the time, and I was working with lots of people who were traveling around the world, researchers, and they do all this amazing research, and they put it all in this really text-heavy, dense reports, which I've got to be honest was really interesting, but I never read, mostly because they were just full of text. But when I spoke to these people at lunchtime, and they told me about their stories, it was really fascinating, and I was really engaged. And I guess that's where the idea came from, really. It's how I really got into data visualization. I worked with a few of them to kind of like highlight their data and information, and really fell in love with it. And then I decided to start my business. So regarding data visualization, why now? Why data viz now? Why is it an important thing right now? Well, information overload is essentially why now. We all get bombarded with information every single day. We can't escape it. It's inescapable on our mobile phones and tablets and computers. And this infographic here shows some of that information. This infographic is actually at least a year old, so it's out of date. But just to give you an idea of how much information happens every minute of every day, that is essentially what this infographic is showing. To give you a couple of examples, on Instagram, every minute of every day, there are 49,000 photos shared. Every minute of every day, there are 13 million texts sent around the world. Every minute of every day, there are about 500,000 tweets that happen. This number is growing exponentially. And I'm sure you've all heard the phrase that we all live in an attention economy. It is certainly true. Our attention is more valuable now than ever. The situation has also been heightened given the COVID-19 pandemic we're all going through. I'm sure you've all realized that there are a lot more data visualizations and charts and infographics on the daily news happening all around the world and on social media. So this is so you could say that data visualization is having a bit of a boom, it's having a bit of a rebirth right now. Before we jump into it, I came across this quote yesterday and I really liked it and I wanted to include it. Essentially, it says, consistently good data viz requires a good mechanical understanding of the tool or library, a keen, creative eye, a love of data, a willingness to iterate, and a relentless focus on what is useful. This was a quote by a chap called Quinn Moto. The truth is, I have no idea who Quinn Moto is. However, when I came across this, I thought, what a fantastic way of summing it up. I believe that is very much what data visualization is like. You don't really need to be an expert designer with a special tool. You just need to know how to use some basic tools, but it's more about the principles that can help you get started and make your work look a lot more professional and more succinct and straight to the point. The next thing I'd like to look at is some 7 action steps for great data viz that I think are crucial. I'm going to have a quick chat with these, but we're going to go more into each one in the next few slides. The first one is called Know Your Goal. The second is think about your audience. The third is choose the right charts. The fourth is sketch and wireframe. Then we'll talk about choose colors. We'll then talk about how to illuminate your charts. And finally, we'll talk about some distribution. Whenever I work on any data visualization, I jump through these steps every time, and it really allows me to kind of get the basics right and get a kind of framework to work through so that I haven't missed anything. So let's talk about knowing your goal. One thing that helps you know your goal is what's called the 5 whys of journalism, which you guys may remember from school or college days. 5 whys are why, who, when, what, and where. Essentially, you're trying to tell a story with every data visualization or infographic. You've got to assume that the person who's looking at that doesn't know as much information as you do. So you're essentially trying to cover your bases to give them at a glance. You're trying to answer these questions for them at a glance. It's really important to know your goal before you start your data visualizations. I can't tell you the amount of times, a few years ago when I didn't know my goal. I'd sort of get my data or get a report and kind of get excited and want to jump right into it, get my hands dirty, get into the nitty gritty. And I'd say to myself, oh, I'll just spend, half an hour, 45 minutes kind of like looking at this data. And the truth is, every time I did that, an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours would go by, and I would have gone, oh, this is interesting, oh, that's interesting, and that's interesting. And I would have endlessly found new interesting things. But the problem was there wasn't a common thread between these points or these questions I was asking the data, and I was essentially chasing my tail. I'd end up a few hours later, tired, despondent, and not having gone any further forward. I'd feel as though I knew my data really well, but I wasn't really going anywhere. So to try and save you that time, it's really good to have a purpose and to have a goal right at the beginning, right from the offset. So how can we go about focusing our goal? Well, what can really help is to focus your message. So you kind of think about your goal. What are you trying to achieve with this data visualization? Are you trying to achieve explanatory information? Are you trying to prove a salient point? When you're trying to focus your message, think about your big idea. What's the big idea? If someone just said to you, with this chart or with this data viz, what are you trying to achieve? What's the big idea you're trying to convey across? This is really important to keep this at the forefront of your mind. In fact, I would very much recommend that you write it down in a couple of sentences because it really helps you stay on point. What's your point of view on this issue, on this conflict, on this problem that you're communicating through your data visualization? What do you think needs to be done as a result of your view or the point you're trying to make? What are the consequences if nothing gets done? What's the key message you want to get across? I always write this down in a couple of lines because an hour or 2 hours later or a day later, when you come back to it, if you haven't got that clear of mind, once again, you could inadvertently go off on another tangent and that just wastes time and you end up chasing your tail again. So those two key things are really key right from the offset. Another really important thing to think about is your audience. If you guys create a report and you're sending it out to the general public, the kind of information, the level of technicality in the report is different than if you were doing it for a closed group that were a specialist group, for instance, or a market research conference, or if you were working with the health industry. The kind of information or acronyms or data that you can present and the way you do it is massively different depending on the audience. Every industry has its own language, not just its own acronyms, the way they say things. It's really important because if you use the language of the industry, it makes the people reading that feel as though you really understand them, where you're coming from there, you know where they're coming from. So really think about this right from the offset. Speak their language, i.e. the audience's language. Numeracy level and precision. Are these people a group of scientists who to them, precision is really important. It's all about the fine details, in which case you need to reflect this in your data visualization. If it's the general public, I would argue you probably don't need a massive precision level because you could probably make your point without going into that much level of detail. Does your audience love data or are they data averse? Would it be better for you to strip out the data and try and use more words and use more illustrations to convey? Or are they a mathematical audience who they really love data and they love the mechanics and the technicalities of these things? Plus also think about time constraints. Are they time poor? How much time are they going to look at your data visualization? If you're putting out data visualization on social media, the chances are whoever's going to look at it is going to be time poor because they're skimming through their social media feeds and they're not going to give it too much time. However, if you're putting a data visualization into a report and you're delivering this report to the relevant audience, the chances are the person is going to look at this data visualization, will be willing to spend more time because it's very relevant to them and they're very much interested in what it is you're trying to convey. Choosing charts. Excuse me. Choosing charts is a really important topic. Certain charts are good for certain things. And in the next few slides, we'll look at some different chart examples and look at their pros and cons. Basically, if you're unsure of which chart to use, stick to the classics, which we'll look at in a minute. If you're really confident about what you're doing and your audience is used to looking at different chart types, well, then they are specialist chart types that can work better than the classics. But the truth be told, you could probably put a couple of classic charts together and that would do the job of a complicated one. It really depends on your audience. The key message with charts is if there's no value in a chart, don't create a chart. Don't create a chart because you feel you need to do a chart. If it's not adding any value, it's just a distraction. And excuse me. And it may well damage what the information you're trying to convey across as opposed to enhance it. So basically, only use a fancy chart if you've got a good reason for it and your audience is used to looking at this kind of charts, and only even add a chart if it adds value. And if you're unsure which chart to use, to stick to the classics and don't choose a fancy one because it looks good. But before we get to about choosing charts, we need to think about our data. Here I'd like to talk about knowing your data. It's always a good idea to know your data inside out. Has it got any outliers? Are there any particular trends? Whenever I start analyzing my data, if I've focused my message and I know what my goal is, when you're analyzing your data, you are at the very least subconsciously looking for outliers or trends that support your goal or the message you're trying to get across. Here is that classic trap where if you don't know what you're trying, if you don't know which direction you're heading in, and you start analyzing your data looking for trends or outliers, you can find a whole host of trends or outliers that aren't supporting your message, which are all very quote unquote interesting, but ultimately aren't very useful because they're not helping you achieve what you're trying to. And also, I would advise that when you're working with charts, it's always good to highlight a single message in a chart. Sometimes people feel as though good data visualization practice is to squeeze two charts into one or two data points into one thing. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, that sometimes confuses people. It's probably better if you feel you should highlight more than one point. Well, then you need to use two charts. You could use one chart to analyze and another chart to communicate. So that being said, let's look at probably the most common chart of all, the humble pie chart. Some people love pie charts, some people loathe pie charts. But whatever you can say about pie charts, they're probably the most recognizable and the most common chart in the world. It's not that pie charts are good or bad, it's that I think people aren't necessarily understand how the best way to go about using them. Pie charts are great when you're trying to show parts of a whole type of data. When you're trying to communicate, the angles and the area communicates, the parts. The main issue I see with pie charts is that people use too many slices. Good practice is to use no more than 5 slices. Basically, humans aren't very good at discerning the different sizes between the slices. We're much better at that with bar charts and other things, which we'll look at in a second. But it's really hard for us to look at one slice that's a similar size to the other slice and then figure out which one is actually bigger or which one is smaller. This is why people find pie charts really hard to look at sometimes. And also we put too many labels on them and it's distracting and that kind of thing. But essentially pie charts should only be used when you're trying to communicate a general pattern in something, definitely not for precision, because people find it too hard to discern that. If I move on to the bar charts are great for communicating precision. If you've got lots of data points that are very similar, if you put them in a bar chart, it's much easier for the human eye to discern which one is above or which one is below, etc., etc. They're very good for communicating length and specifics and precision, like I mentioned earlier. It's also a good practice to start the axis at 0. Sometimes when there's a really fine line of precision, this might not necessarily be the case, but then I would argue that you really need to communicate that and make that as bold and as legible as possible, because the human tendency is to assume that something is starting from 0, and that could distort the variability in your values when someone looks at your chart. The third most common chart example is the line chart. Line charts are great for changes over time. And I think the main issue I see with line charts is that people use too many lines on the chart and it's really confusing and nobody knows where to look. Better to use fewer lines. If you have to use many lines, if there were 20 lines per se, a good trick is to highlight only one line in the color, and then all the other lines, gray them out, just make them a light gray. That way, people can see the general pattern of all the other not so relevant data and all the other not so relevant trends, but the key trend you're trying to highlight will be highlighted in the bold color that stands out. So people will know exactly what to look at and won't get too confused. So now we looked at the most common chart types. How can you go about putting these charts together? The best thing I can advise you to do is before you start putting the charts, before you even think about what kind of chart you want to use, I always recommend you do some freehand design. Now, you don't have to be an artist. As you can see, I'm very rough and ready. I basically use a Sharpie and a piece of paper to start all my freehand design. I find this is really, really important. It helps get the creative juices going. It gives you an idea of where everything's going to go. And also, it stops you using the defaults. One of the crimes against data viz, if you like, it might sound a bit harsh, but is when people use default settings and default colors in their software. Whenever someone looks at your chart, they're going to know instantly that you've used the default settings in Excel or PowerPoint or whatever it is your tool of choice. People have been seeing these default settings for the last couple of decades, to be honest with you. And what I find is whenever I've used a tool straight away to create a data viz without doing the freehand design process first, I always end up using the route of least resistance. I'll just select my data and click on the recommend chart type, and whichever one seems to fit, I'll use. And then all your charts end up looking the same, and you have no idea really where you're going with colors. I mean, I usually use colored Sharpies as well. This one's just what happens today. I was putting this together. I only had black color. But yeah, it's actually really enjoyable, and I can't recommend it enough to sort of like get a piece of paper and map out exactly a rough idea of where you're trying to go. Do it as many times as possible, and yeah, I recommend starting that way first. Next, we're going to look at color. Color is very important. I mean, I could almost do a whole webinar on color, but as I've mentioned earlier, one of the main things to remember regarding color is don't use default colors. Use brand colors, either your business's brand colors or your client's brand colors, and always use an action color, which I shall highlight in a few slides' time. An action color is a color that stands out, that catches the eye, that differentiates itself. You're essentially using an action color to draw the eye, to say to the viewer or the audience member, look at this, here is my point. Making it easier for them to understand your information. Brand colors also make your data visualizations look more professional straight off the bat. And then also there's a consistency between your data viz and the slide or the report and the website and everything else. The next section I'd like to talk about is called the Illuminate section. And here is where we shine a light on important information in our data viz. Using an action color that I spoke about a second ago is one method of doing that. But also in the Illuminate stage, we can use things like annotations and labels. On the left-hand side is a chart under the below heading that's got axis labels, vertical axis labels, as well as horizontal ones, as well as the values in the bar charts and the grid lines and everything. And essentially, a lot of the times when people, when people create their charts, they kind of leave all the default settings, everything on there. And that's not necessarily the case. When it comes to data visualization, everything you leave on there needs to serve a purpose. You need to be saying, okay, I've left these axis labels there because of X, Y, Z. It's going to be useful for this person, for this purpose, etc., etc. To give you an idea of what you could take away, if you look at under the after label, after high title, in that example, I've left the x-axis and y-axis values there because the person's looking at the top of the bar charts and they can see the values there. But on the bottom right-hand column chart, I've taken the x-axis and y-axis labels away, and instead I've written the values inside the chart. So you can see you don't actually need those values on the outside of the axis all the time. You can kind of put those values on the inside, just to give you a sort of idea of the kind of things that are possible. And also just to sort of say, these, in this example, spot the deliberate error, we don't actually need these. These shouldn't be here. Because I've put these values here, 72, 45, 41, then we don't need these values. Therefore, the person doesn't have to look here and then go to here like they would be doing here. They wanted to see that was 60. Essentially, what we're trying to do is avoid a zigzag where a person is looking left and looking right and trying to figure out what's going on. These are just some of the techniques that you can use to achieve that. Next thing I'd like to talk about is decluttering. Decluttering is essentially just a process of removing anything that distracts from your message. As I mentioned earlier, unless it supports or helps the viewer understand something, then just take it away. Everything there, you should have a reason for leaving everything on the chart. Grid lines and x-axis are sometimes, you have to decide, use your judgment call as to whether or not it's actually helpful. If you can't think of a reason why it's helpful, then I would suggest you remove it. Finally, the distribute and promote phase. Once you spend your time creating your data viz or infographic, it's important to note that you do need to spend some time promoting it, whether it's a report. I mean, obviously, if it's a report, you create a report, you hand it over to the client, well, then that's kind of out of your hands. I'm talking about data viz that you have that's in your possession. It's, if you're going to put some time into making your data viz more clearer and more attractive, it's worth getting as much value as you can out of it. And that's usually comes from promoting it. I'd probably recommend you promote it for 2 to 3 weeks afterwards. You can actually get a lot of mileage out of data visualizations. You can kind of take key messages from them. You can break them apart. You can, take one message and just, take the whole chart and take all these little snippets of the messages and kind of put those on social media. So you can get more value out of it. It's just important to remember, think about the medium you're promoting it on, how much time the person is going to have on that medium. So if you're going to put it out on social media, you're probably just going to want to highlight a key metric or a key performance indicator, whereas instead of putting a whole chart or an infographic on a social media post, because people aren't going to have the time to read that, whereas you probably want to put the kind of the big long infographic on your website or in a report where people will sit down and have more time to look at that. So that being said, I'd like to jump into some chart makeovers that we did earlier. Firstly, I'd like to thank those members of the ICG who sent through some of their reports. I really appreciate that. And I'd like to have a look at this report, which was from Stephen Berfeld from Purple Research. And this report talked about the impact of COVID-19. First, the things I like about this report was the blue box of kind of like contextual information that's kind of in this section. That's really helpful to help me understand what was going on, because I didn't know what a PMI was, and that really helps. For those who don't know, PMI is a Purchasing Managers Index, and it's basically a UK health. It's an index that talks about the health of the UK economy, essentially. I also liked the source details at the bottom. I thought that was really good. And the call out here, which I thought was really useful, definitely. But I looked at this chart and I thought I could definitely make a couple of suggestions about how we could improve it. This is the chart after I made it over. I changed the title because the title originally said UK business activity has also slumped to a record low, which is okay. But I just thought that it could be improved by basically saying business activities in the UK has slumped to a record low during the COVID-19 lockdown. This gives a more succinct kind of impression of exactly what the whole picture of what's going on. Plus also in our slides and data viz now, there's a phenomenon where now, I can't remember what the word is for it, but people take screenshots of your slides of your reports all the time to basically show their boss or to show their colleagues or to show, people they work with. So even though the original title worked reasonably well in the context of this report, it didn't give the whole picture. If you each kind of data visualization is a good idea for it to be able to stand on its own in case they just took a snapshot of this or a screenshot. I also changed the blue box that had some contextual information and decided to put it basically as a subheading. This is kind of thinking more about the text hierarchy. I kind of simplified the words, and I also used Stephen's brand colors to highlight what I thought were the key messages in that bit of contextual information. I also changed the title of the chart a bit, and I changed the chart. I mean, the original chart was a line chart, which was fine, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, line charts they do show changes over time, which this chart does, but because of the level of precision involved, I thought it was better to use a bar chart because we can see the values and how they relate to each other. As you can see, I also took away the axes here and here because I put the values in the charts here. And also what I thought was useful was in the contextual information, Stephen talked about the fact that the lowest level during the 2008 crisis was 53.3. I thought it'd be really good to kind of put that as a benchmark on this chart to give people more kind of context as to where we are in relation to that. And then this is what I talked about earlier called, this is what I described using an action color. Straight away, when you look at this chart, you look at the red, and the red is the point we're trying to make here in April. That was the value, and that just gives the person straight away an idea of where we are today versus where we were at our lowest ebb during the 2008 crisis. And then I decluttered it, as I mentioned earlier. I took away anything that I didn't feel was adding to the message, and yeah, that's what I did with that. The next chart I'd like to look at is a couple of charts from the impact of COVID-19 survey. Thank you to Keith Meadows and Peter Martin for sharing this, and some really interesting insights as well in this report. I looked at one of the questions, which was, do you think the research industry can help the wider economy and society during the crisis? Which I thought was a very interesting one, and there was lots of opinions and thrown in there. And on the report, there was this pie chart, which is perfectly fine. And in the appendix, there was lots and lots and lots of answers and responses to that. And I just thought it could be really interesting to combine these two, combining quant data as well as qual data into one, because this added really good context to this here. So to be honest with you, in my freehand, I just drew one of those and kind of some squiggles to kind of signify that. And I thought, well, how can I add these two together? And I ended up coming up with this. This is the same, the two charts combined into one. Essentially, I turned the pie chart into this bar chart. And then what I did was I took some examples from the appendix and put it here. Now, I didn't have the opportunity to talk to these guys to specifically understand exactly what information was what. And I just made assumptions just for illustrative purposes about what was positive, what was negative, and what the point was they were trying to make with those charts. So please forgive me, guys, if I misunderstand. If I misunderstood, it's just my own interpretation. I think this is a useful way of kind of giving context. You can get an overall idea of the kind of balance of yes versus no, but at the same time, you can get some kind of like contextual information of how people are feeling and where they're kind of their thoughts and that kind of thing. And of course, if people, by all means, still keep the appendix information there, if people want to read more about those examples, well, then they can obviously jump to the appendix at the back. Staying on the qual data theme, I took the same question and I created a word cloud. Now, word cloud, a bit like pie charts, divide the community. Some people love them and some people hate them. And I'd like to talk about the pros and the cons with the word cloud. Firstly, I took the entire appendix for that question. Do you think all the responses, do you think the research agency can help the wider economy? And I put it into a word cloud piece of software, which is free. It's called Wordle. And for those who are interested, you could also use an add-in for Microsoft Office called Pro Word Cloud, which is all free. And I put it in there, and I guess this is what is wrong with word clouds. This doesn't really give us any context. It's like, all we can see is words like research, online, industry, and that's all very interesting. But how does that really relate to answering the question, do you think the research industry can help the wider economy and society during the crisis? So I think this is the main issue with word clouds. People just take their information, chuck them in there, think they look pretty, which they do look pretty, and then kind of put it out there. So an improvement to this would be, this is an example I saw on the internet, would be to ask a one-word question. So, you know, you should say, what one word would you use to describe this? And for instance, the next example is, what one word would you use to describe our product? And therefore, within the context of what one word would you use to describe our product, word clouds can be very useful. Then straight away, you get the idea of breathtaking, powerful, delightful, that kind of thing. And it really helps. It's contextual and a lot more useful that way. So yeah, I'd advise in the interview, try and throw one of these questions in there. Finally, onto our tools and resources. There are many tools out there to get you started with data visualizations. But the truth is, you've probably already been using some of them anyway. On the top left is Adobe Illustrator. This is not free, but this is the market leader in illustrative and data visualization products. Very good, not cheap. Canva is free and paid. The free version, I love Canva, it's brilliant. I use it all the time. It's really good for data viz, infographics, and the like. For novice and professionals as well. So if you not really know what you're doing, you can definitely start off using that. Inkscape is an open source alternative to Adobe Illustrator. It's not for the beginners, but a fantastic tool, equally as good as that, except this is free and open source. If you'd like to create infographics as opposed to data visualizations, then software like Venngage, Infogram, and PictureShot are very good to get you started. They've all got free versions, and they're what you call freemium. You'd pay, you can have a subscription once you want to use, you know, lots of different templates or whatever, but essentially they've got templates that you can use for free and with varying degrees of quality. But yeah, they're all very good to get you started. Plotly is essentially Excel on steroids, but with a very easy user interface. If you're not fond of Excel, you could use Plotly. Once you've formatted your data, you could chuck it in there, and you can host it on the internet and everything, which is an advantage of using Plotly versus Excel. Mapbox is it's Google Maps it's a very user-friendly version of Google Maps, really. You can create interactive maps, and you don't have to be an expert at map creating. Very good, once again, free version and a paid version. Tableau and Power BI, this is Microsoft's product, Power BI and Tableau. They're both excellent data viz products, but they're definitely more for the pros. I wouldn't say these were for beginners, the people who didn't know, who were just starting off in their data viz journeys. And of course, Excel and PowerPoint, humble Excel and PowerPoint. Love them, started off using Excel and PowerPoint, still very much use Excel and PowerPoint as a starting point. In fact, some of the makeovers I did entirely in PowerPoint. Other ones I use Excel and Inkscape for. And yes, by all means, fantastic tools. And thank you all for having me. And if you've got any questions, and by all means, please ask them in a minute. I will answer a few of those in a minute. But if you'd like, I offer a free hour data viz review. Happy to have a chat, no strings attached, to kind of see what kind of stuff you're working on and see what can be done. And yes, hope you enjoyed so far. And over to you, Sally.
Okay, thank you so much, Soti. That was really very interesting, very useful. I particularly liked your advice on avoiding the eye zigzags in charts and decluttering. I shall definitely be putting those into practice in the future. So we haven't got very many questions yet, so please send through any questions that you can think of. We do have one, however. Will you be sharing this presentation at the end of the session? I think I can probably answer that one. So yes, the recording will go onto the ICG website, so you'll be able to look at it again and refer back to it, no problem. Are there any other questions being sent through? Yes, okay, they're coming through now. So which of your data viz are you most proud of and why?
Ooh, I've never been asked to discriminate between my data viz. I don't know that the ones that just cut to the chase. I like really plain, simple data viz, because sometimes I've also done long infographics, which are great, which go over several pages, and those are great, and those tell stories, and they're fantastic. But I think it's more the ones, I like a clean style. I like to cut to the chase. I like to get it. I think people are really busy, and I think it's our duty to minimize the amount of time that they spend trying to decipher what it is that we're doing. We owe it to our audience and to everyone else to give them our information in as palatable and as clear and as succinct a form as possible. So yeah, I can't answer that. I don't have a favorite, but yeah, my favorite ones, the ones I like the most, are the ones that are straight to the point, quick and easy, and you don't have to spend too much time deciphering or reading.
Okay, so we have another question. So trackers are hard to recreate each wave. Clients tend to like them to look the same every time. What advice can you offer to make tracking reports pop?
So I just say tracking reports.
Yeah, so when you're looking at data over time, you're comparing waves of data.
I think what you could do to make them pop is annotate them. I mean, I completely understand you've got a template, you've got things to work within, you've got parameters to work within. Whereas if I went back to this chart I spoke about earlier, using these sorts of tricks like annotating, highlighting the colors. You can even add like some extra commentary through a call out. Yes, if you're stuck within a template, the only thing you can add to these things are annotations and kind of give more context and add more of a quote unquote story element to it by using those sorts of things. Really, yes, I'd advise doing that.
Okay, great presentation, thank you. Is the infographic software you mentioned easy to use? And when would you use infographics versus charts?
The one I recommended, I'm not sure which one you mean, because I recommended a few of them.
Which would you say are the easiest if you're starting out in producing infographics? Which one would you tend to go to?
I would say this one, picture chart, this one, infogram, and this one, because those have a web interface where you can drag and drop elements onto it. But those are great for infographics as opposed to charts. And charts, I would say, Plotly is the one I would start with if I wanted to create charts and didn't want to use Excel for my charts. These, like I said, these have drag and drop elements. So you could have icons, you could have stop sign, you could have icons of people, icons of animals, icons of computers to try and convey information, and they have a drag and drop interface. So I'd definitely recommend picture chart, infogram, and Venn gauge for that.
And when would you use infographics versus charts? How would you decide when it's appropriate to use each?
Basically, depending on what your goal is, if your goal is to tell a story, you're better off using, that's not entirely, depends how long the story is. Infographics are better for telling a more drawn out story, a kind of more of a sequence of events. This happened and that happened and that happened. It's much easier to do that in infographics, because in charts, essentially one chart highlights one message. I mean, you can give, but you're always telling a story with every single chart as well, which may or may not help. But anyway, the point is, in the heading, the title of your chart gives context. The subtitle of your charts can give a bit more of a background of the story. And then the chart itself is basically saying what happens now. And at the bottom of your chart, you could then put a little paragraph that kind of talks about what happened in the end and where do we go from here. So if you can squeeze that all onto one chart, but then use one chart, or you may want to use two charts just to say where we are now and where we want to go. It's more a case of infographics. If you want to tell a more drawn out story than this is where we are, this is what we should do, or this is where we are. Can you see what I mean? Yeah, more the length of story you're trying to tell, I'd say.
Okay. Do certain designs work better if we want an interactive data viz? For example, filters, time-based, waves of data. That's sort of going back to what we discussed with regard to tracking data, isn't it, really? Don't know if you want to add anything to that.
So what was the question again?
Do certain designs work better if we want an interactive data viz? For example, filters, time-based, or waves of data?
No, it really depends, because they can all be made interactive, really. You can have an interactive pie chart, interactive line chart, interactive bar chart. You can have interactive timelines even, which is another great qual data viz technique. It all depends on what you're trying to convey. If you suddenly thought, oh, we're showing this kind of tracking information and we want to kind of tell the story over a timeline in an infographic kind of way, well, the timeline is great for it. And then you can create it, make it interactive so that you'd click on a time period and it would focus on that time period in the timeline, and click on another timeline and it would move across. So it all depends on, I would say, don't worry about that. Focus more on what's the best chart type to convey the kind of information, and then figure out about making it interactive if you have the time and resources to do so.
Okay, so another question here. I've seen a lot of presentations from larger agencies where they think icons equals data viz, and they look very cluttered. However, sometimes icons can be useful visual signposts. Are there any sources for icons that you would recommend? So you've mentioned that there are icons in some of the software that you've put forward already, but which ones would you go to if you were particularly looking for icons?
There's a website called Flaticon, Flaticon, and that's an icon repository, if you like. And once again, they have many free icons. You can also, and paid icons. So yeah, I mean, that's where I get a lot of my icons from. Flaticon.com.
Okay. Are there any AI tools where you can pop your charts in and get a data viz output?
Yes, there's two. There's a Google one, there's a Microsoft one. There's the Google one, I think it's called Google Analyze. And basically, if you put your chart data into Google Sheet, it's either on the right-hand side or it's in one of the menus. It's called Google Analyze, and it brings up this side panel, and it basically analyzes your data and gives you like 10, 20 charts that kind of give you some insights to it. The Microsoft version only works with Microsoft Online or Office 365, I believe. So it doesn't work if you've got a desktop version of Office 2013 or earlier or later, sorry. And that does a similar sort of thing. I have used these things and they can be helpful, but once again, I would say the first time I used it, I plugged in some data and thought, ooh, that looks interesting, and that looks interesting. And I was using the Microsoft one, and I ended up with like 50 charts. And honestly, did I think it helped? It kind of helped, it does kind of help if you, but the truth is I still recommend knowing your goal or focusing a message before you do that, because otherwise, basically, instead of you doing all the hard work of analyzing and finding out all these insights, the computer does it for you, but then you're still no closer to kind of making a decision on what's useful or not, because you didn't really know where you were coming from to begin with. So yeah, definitely on a Google sheet, it's called Google Analyze, I believe, and on Microsoft, it's called, oh, I can't remember what I just said now. Did I say what it was called earlier? Microsoft, oh, I can't remember. If I said it earlier, I can't remember what I said it was called. But yeah, right now it escapes me. But yes, there is a functionality within Microsoft Excel that allows you to do that.
Okay, great. A couple of questions on colours. So can you say a little bit more about action colours, please? And also, I agree about using brand colours, but have you ever run into problems by inadvertently breaking clients' brand guidelines? So first of all, a bit about action colours.
Action colors are basically colors that stand out. And if I go back to, in this slide, I would say this is my brand colors is, my action color is yellow. So here I did that there. I didn't have to, but I did that there. And on Stephen's chart, he used red. I used red as his action color. Once again, I just made it, I just interpreted that. That may not be correct. Basically, in your color palette, you want to choose a color that basically stands out. So yeah, in my color palette, the color that stands out most in my brand set of colors is yellow. So I use that. And with your client's brand colors, I would just look at they should have a style sheet. And if they don't have a style sheet, look at their website or look at their reports and look at all the colors they're using and basically just choose one that's the most vivid. And all you're trying to do with an action color is draw the person's eye to a part of the chart. So an element on the chart, a label, a section of the chart, anything. That's all it is. So just choose the most distinctive color in their color palette. And so what was the other point, the other question?
Have you ever inadvertently broken the client's brand guidelines?
No, because I always say to the client, have you got a brand style guide? And if they have, great, that's nice and simple. And if they haven't got one, then I just ask for a preview. Either the report I'm working on will have colors that the clients use because that's the report that they created, and I'll take the colors from that, or I'll go to the client's website and take the colors from that. So yeah, there's no way really to break the client. There's no really excuse really, if you see what I mean, because the most important thing is you have to stay on brand, because the data viz needs to look like it belongs to the client's business. It's part of their product. It looks more professional. If you break the colors and the star guide, then it doesn't look like it belongs. It looks like something other. It looks different. And yeah, it just basically just clashes with everything else.
Okay, just a couple more questions. So what was the name of the program with the black icon that looks like a pointing arrow upwards? And I'm not quite sure whether you can think of where that was used. Can you?
I think I mean this one. I think that's the only program that kind of looks like an arrow. That's called Inkscape, and that is an illustration program. It's a direct competitor to Adobe Illustrator, and yeah, I'm a big fan of that. To use that all the time. It basically allows you complete freedom. So let's say you knocked up your chart in Excel, or PowerPoint. You could then import it into that program, and then you could touch it up and do anything. Basically, yeah, you have complete freedom to move anything around and that kind of thing. I mean, the difference is if you're using Excel or PowerPoint to do these things I'm recommending to you, you can do them in Excel or PowerPoint. They just might be more hoops you've got to jump through. You just have to deal with the idiosyncrasies of Excel and PowerPoint. to do this and that. I mean, they are still pretty flexible. You would just have to spend more time digging in the menu system going, okay, well, how do I change the font color for this access value versus that one? And how do I mean, for instance, if you wanted to make an action color on an Excel chart, you'd grab one of the bars, but Excel automatically selects all of the bars, but you have to wait like 2 seconds and then click on the same bar again. And then Excel understands that you mean that singular bar as opposed to all the bars. And then you can change the color, and then Excel allows you to change the color for that one bar versus all the other bars. So that's what I mean by the idiosyncrasies of Excel. You have to kind of work that out or Google, find that out. Whereas in a program like Inkscape or Adobe Illustrator, you could just click on the bar you wanted and change it to an action color.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you. There's just one more question, I think. Thank you, Soti. And how would you handle the huge number of photos people upload when doing online community groups? Have you got any tips there?
Handle a huge amount of photos.
So how would you show photos in a presentation?
Oh, show photos in a presentation. I guess I'm not entirely sure I understand what the question is. Do you mean more, how do you show them all on a page, or how do you deal from a technical perspective, the volume of them on an online community?
Well, probably showing them on the page. How would you, the question is, how would you handle the huge number of photos people upload when doing online community groups? How do you show them? Any tips for showing a large number of photos within a presentation?
Oh, I think a large number of photos, I'd just make thumbnails out of them. I'd make them all, I'd tile them like, what do I mean by that? I'd make each one like that size, and I'd stack them next to each other, pretty much like how I'm stacking that, and that, but I'd make them all, you know, all touching. And to do that, I'd use a program like this or this. I mean, I suppose you could use PowerPoint. I guess it just depends on the size of the photos and the sheer amount, really. At some point, it will probably slow PowerPoint down if you did loads and loads of photos, because it's not designed for that. But yeah, I would say I would do that in PowerPoint first, give it a try. If it doesn't crash, depending on the size of your photos, by all means, carry on. If not, I'd probably use Inkscape. You may be able to use Canva for that. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, that's what I would do.
Okay, well, thank you, Soti. I think our time is up. Thank you very much for sharing all that with us, and I'm sure we'll go away and think on that, and hopefully the quality of our presentations will improve exponentially following your advice. So thanks
Excellent.
again.
Glad to be of service.
And thank you to everybody for logging in and for listening. Hope you found it useful and interesting. So just to say now, I hope you have a good rest of the day, and please don't forget to sign up for our next webinars, because we've got an action-packed program over the next few weeks. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.